Has anyone ever been to a wedding where someone objected? Tell us the story. Not exactly an objection, but I worked as a photographer at a wedding chapel on the Vegas Strip. We had a young Chinese couple come in with their friends and get married. The minister did his normal speech, but when it came down to the vows I could tell something was wrong. The groom kept putting the ring on the bride's finger and taking it off hesitantly. This went on for a few uncomfortable minutes. At one point the groom asked the bride if there was someone else and she nodded her head. After a couple more awkward moments, the minister explained that if he did not pronounce them man and wife it wouldn't be legal. They decided not to get married. Their friends still bought the DVD though. That was one of my favorite moments working there. Yep. Lots of lawyers. It was a joke between the groomsmen. They all said it in unison. Everyone laughed, except the bride and her parents. Good times. At one wedding, the bride's mother stood up and objected. She said, "I love you, groom, and I don't want anyone else as a son-in-law. But my daughter is exactly like me, and I wouldn't be able to let this wedding continue if I didn't warn you about the mess we make out of the lives of people we love. Make sure you want this," then sat back down. When I read the first part of your comment, I was convinced the bride's mother was going to stand up and make a play for the groom. When I was about 15, I was at my uncle's wedding. When they asked if anyone objected, my dad slipped ice down the back of my shirt. I proceeded to jump up startled and everyone turned to me in shock. I sit back down without saying a word and my dad laughed like a hyena. Everyone was very confused. I'm in love with your dad. I've seen a mother-in-law at a wedding get hammered on Jack Daniels and proceed to call the bride a dirty W right before the ceremony started. Then have to be escorted out after she jumped up and started yelling when they asked if anyone objected. Now that was a freaking great wedding. Jack Daniels and a wedding. Always a nice mix. I was a date for a wedding where the bride and groom got into a huge fight during the reception and threw their wedding rings at each other in the parking lot. They didn't stay married for very long. My grandpa used to call those people two south poles like on a magnet. You can shove them together and make them touch each other for brief periods of time, but they'll never become one. Stupid people think they can win at weddings by getting through it. Ha, that's just the starting line. My boyfriend's sister got married in a boat that was cruising down the Intracoastal Waterway in South Florida. During the vows, someone from a nearby unrelated boat shouted up, "Don't do it. It's a mistake," to where we all were on the top deck. Fortunately, everyone just laughed, after a brief moment of suspecting the groom was involved, because it was exactly the sort of prank he'd pull. I was about 17 at my uncle Calvin's wedding. When the pastor said, "Does anyone have any reason why these two should not be wed?" a rather large unattractive woman stood up and said, "Wonder you so stupid. You know I was with Calvin last night." Then she left while everyone is picking up their jaws from the ground. The pastor tried to brush it off as nonsense and continue, but my brother and I were about to explode from holding in our laughs. I heard a squeak from him and I lost it. Full on hard laughter until my dad looked at us down the aisle with the death stare. Most awkward situation I've ever been in. I can hear this woman saying it in a deep southern accent. During the groom's speech at a wedding I attended, he told his new wife how much he loved her, but unfortunately called her by his ex-girlfriend's name. There was a moment's silence before he corrected himself, then laughter, horrified looks depending on how drunk related to the bride you were. They are still happily married. A little prehistory. My stepdad used to be in a mock gunfighting group and had prop guns that fired blanks. They did a number of shows around the city and took all the safety precautions. My mom's wedding was a Western style wedding. My stepdad was dressed as a cowboy, as was his best man. When it came time to ask if anyone had any objections, one of the other gunfight group members stood up and proclaimed that he had seen her first. Before he could go any further, the best man shot him with his prop gun, thus resulting in a short-lived gunfight around the assembly. The groom's side prevailed and the wedding continued as planned. I was one of maybe 10 people that knew this was even going to happen, so it was pretty entertaining to see the reactions from the rest of the assembly. This is approximately the neatest theme and twist I could ever hope to add to a wedding. After all, the whole point of having a wedding is to entertain and satisfy your loved ones while making your union unique and personal. They done did it. At my sister's wedding, my brother objected and said he was a piece of crap and she deserves better, which was true. Fun wedding. I went to my step-aunt's wedding, ex-stepmom's sister, a few years ago, and her fiancé was a cool stoner dude, Bodine, from Trinidad, immigrated to Canada, and she was a Scottish heritage white Catholic girl, so obviously, the families were kinda iffy. Anyways, it gets to this lax ceremony wherein the bride flew in from a seaplane to the beach. Father was a pilot. It was pretty cool, and the vows are being done. So Bodine's father stands up at the objection part, completely hammered, and everyone is frozen. His wife is absolutely mortified, and then he just smiles and yells "Nah, just kidding," and sits back down, laughing. Bride and groom thought it was hilarious, but everyone else was awkward for the rest of the ceremony. I can hear his voice in my head. What a funny guy. I used to shoot wedding videos with Butthole Studios. Note used to, and there was a wedding where we drove nearly 80 miles from the studio, San Francisco to be exact, and the bride's mom objects. I turned my camera to her to catch the sweet action, only to hear her say she slept with the groom once. The wedding didn't continue, and part of our policy in the contract, once we are there they have to pay in full even if there is an objection. If you had a copy of the tape you'd have the top comment. Everyone objected to my brother's wedding. So much so people outright refused to go to the wedding. It lasted 4 weeks. If someone told me a wedding I was invited to was going to take 4 weeks to finish, I'd RSVP no as well. There was a really great drama a few years ago from a bride that this happened to. If I remember correctly, her best friend, maid of honor, objected because she had been sleeping with the groom. The bride then vomited everywhere and the bride's father ran up and punched out the groom. Then all the guests left awkwardly. It was one of the best dramas I've ever seen. I tried searching for it but had no luck. When I saw it was right around the time all the ex-Dig users came to Reddit, so someone asked for the best dramas newer Redditors had missed, and this was one of them. I'm a woman who vomited on the altar of my own wedding because my maid of honor confessed that she was sleeping with my fiancé. AMA. Catered a wedding where someone should have objected but didn't. After the ceremony, the mother of the bride caught the groom making out with one of the groom's men. A general freakout followed. You may now kiss the bride. It wasn't an objection during the ceremony, but when I went to the wedding of a girl I dated several years ago, her dad approached me during the reception after several drinks and told me that he wished he had married me instead. I recommended that he keep that to himself. Not sure if I'd want to go to the wedding of an ex. I guess it depends on how the friendship developed afterward, but I feel like that would usually be a form of self-torture. At my dad's wedding, my little brother dropped to his knees and grabbed our dad's leg and shouted, "I object." The pastor made a joke about it later. He was like 5 or 6 when that happened. That's a pretty young pastor. Just thought that everyone might like to know, in case they didn't already, that the request for any objections during a wedding ceremony isn't actually there for heartbroken exes or disgruntled relatives. It's supposed to be an actual inquiry as to whether or not anyone knows of any legal reasons why the bride or groom cannot marry, such as an incomplete divorce, a newlywed being underage, a wife in the attic, etc. Point in case in point, Jane Eyre. Just got back from cousin's wedding today. That never happened. She locked herself in her hotel room and hyperventilated. Tried telling her mom that she needed an ambulance, but her mom thought just jitters. Mom refused the ambulance and told her to get the dress on. Then she screamed and threw a tantrum. Told her mom they have been fighting a lot, some of it physical. There was no music or anything with the bridesmaid running down the aisle either. Happened about 2 hours before the ceremony was to start. They simply told people as they arrived that the wedding was cancelled, but we were all welcome to head over to the reception at 3 for a party. I bailed. I hope I have a receipt for this stupid punch bowl I got as a gift. All the good gifts were taken. Oh wow, well I'm glad your cousin got out of it. Right now it seems like it was bad timing, but better now than down the road with a messy divorce. A friend of mine married a circus performer in New Orleans. It was a fairly large and interesting wedding with lots of really crazy people. Somehow one of the bride's ex-boyfriends crashed the ceremony. During that fateful moment, the officiant asks, "Does anyone object to this union?" The ex, very drunk at this point, fires a wobbly hand into the air, screams yes. me and starts shuffling towards the stage. Without skipping a beat, the groom takes 2 steps forward and punches the interloper in the mouth, knocking him out. They resume the ceremony after raucous applause and laughter. I went to a wedding reception party that they had after the groom slept with someone at the bachelor's party and they didn't want the money to go to wait, so they threw a kick-butt party. It was really tense at the head table though. Not sure if this fits in with the objected theme, but here I go. I got married on Halloween in the French Quarter of New Orleans right in front of the gates of Jackson Square. It was on a Sunday at nightfall, which was hilarious to me. The Black Sabbath. Right there is a really dense, popular area for people to cruise around in. We had a really cool reverend. He actually got his own reality show a few months later, Bourbon Street Brides. It was all real nice and we were finishing the ceremony and everything went off without a hitch. A ton of people, around 70 or more, had actually stopped and watched. Some even videotaped and took pics of it and sat on the stairs of the St. Louis Cathedral, directly across from the gates we were at, about 10 feet away, to watch us. It was awesome. The Reverend had this blind violin player play a song for us to do our first dance as a married couple. Unbeknownst to me, I was focused on my husband. A large group of Christian nutjobs with the big scary signs, "God hates you," "You're going to heck," etc. They were big signs, had gathered and at that moment started yelling at us about how we were sinners and yada yada. Which makes zero sense because we were legitimately getting married. And no, we weren't in costumes. We were in traditional garb. My dress was black. But whatever. My kid sister, who weighs about 100 pounds, went into a rage and ran at the protesters and started screaming, "You Emma trying to ruin my sister's wedding." This started to stir up the crowd and they all started to jump up and scream at these dudes, and then, boom. A huge fight broke out. A bunch of guys I never met fought crazy Christian protesters for my honor. It was freaking awesome. The violinist never stopped playing. We didn't stop dancing and there was a massive brawl happening all around. It was incredible. Then my reverend stepped up like he was Goddamn Gandalf and said, "I am Reverend Anthony Tolliver and you will leave this place." And just like that they did. Kind of an anticlimactic ending, but that's how it goes. I used to work for a high-class catering company. The first wedding of the season a couple years back cost around $8 grand for the catering alone. Everyone brought their A game with style and swank, and the couple looked like they were out of a storybook. The best man took off his pants during his speech. The maid of honor spent half the wedding puking her stomach out, and one of the bridesmaids got into a goddamn fistfight with the mother of the bride in the parking lot. As we bust the tables, every water glass was full and every beer glass empty. We were smoking with some of the guests after cleanup and one of the groomsmen said it was the best wedding he'd ever been to. Agreed. My cousin had her wedding in her new house. Her twin sister wasn't there when the ceremony was supposed to start, but they had the ceremony anyway. When they got to the pause for objections, the doorbell rang, and it was her twin sister. It was a tense moment when somebody opened the door and the sister was there visibly angry. She didn't actually have an objection, she just went to the old house first and ended up being late. At my friend's wedding last year, the priest gets to the point where he says, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." In the subsequent silence, my mate's 2-year-old kid pipes up with a classic high-pitched, "Daddy," and definitely not the case. We all cracked up, and the wedding continued with everyone grinning. Probably doesn't count, but my cousin wrote "help" in white paint on the bottoms of his brother's shoes, so when he and the bride knelt at the altar, Catholic wedding mass, the message was flashed to the crowd. At my friend's wedding a couple of years back, the best man wrote in Tipex on the groom's shoes "game over." It got flashed up as he knelt at the altar too. Everyone in the church was silently in hysterics. The bride was P at the signings. Totally worth it. I was playing guitar in a band which was hired to perform at a wedding reception. The lead singer was friends with the bride, who was quite a stunner. In the dressing room between spots, I asked the singer if he'd ever shagged the bride, to which he gestured as if holding her head against his gyrating hips, receiving oral pleasure. At which point it was realized, the father of the bride was standing in the open doorway smoking a cigarette, looking distinctly unimpressed. The worst part was the silence, as everyone just filtered off, pretending to be busy with something else. Embarrassing but funny. This is late and will no doubt get buried, but it's a good story, so frick it. My dad went to a wedding in the early 90s. The ceremony went fine and they were on to the speeches. The groom's turn came. He stood up, raised his glass, said, "I'd like to thank the best man and my lovely wife, as they've been fricking each other for the past 6 months. Downed his drink and walked out the back. Shocked silence. Apparently the father of the bride then went round in a desperate and futile attempt to get his money back, trying to put the corks back in all the wine bottles, telling everyone party's over. Everyone leave. Most awkward wedding ever." When I was about 16, my cousin on the redneck, pig farming side of my family got married. My cousin, the groom, purposely did not invite his older brother, who was a drunken and butthole nearly 24/7. Midway through the ceremony, in a nice country church, he comes stumbling in, drunk off his butt with a shotgun, yelling, "Why wouldn't you invite your own brother to your wedding? How he fricked the bride first and she will always long for his dong. How she liked to get fricked by the pigs," etc. He starts shooting the shotgun in the air and takes out a window of the church. Luckily it was a double barrel and about 10 guys tackled him when he went to reload. They held him down until the cops arrived. The cops dragged him kicking and screaming to the car and he ended up getting 15 years in prison for various charges. They continued the wedding though, after about an hour of calm down time. Surprisingly, they are still married after 25 years. Historical background. As far as I can remember, the historical basis for this part of the ceremony comes from the days before anyone had any type of photo-id or marriage databases, and you couldn't really prove who was who or if they were already married or not. If you wanted to get married, you could do it 2 ways, by license or by banns. If you got married by license, there was no waiting period, but you usually had to provide written proof from the parish you were born in, and from witnesses who attested to your identity, and pay a fee. If you got married by banns, the marriage intentions were announced at Sunday services for 3 weeks prior to the wedding in the home parish of the bride and the home parish of the groom. Anyone who knew if one or the other had been previously married could then inform the priest and the ceremony would be cancelled. At the wedding ceremony, a final call was made to ask if anyone knew if there was any reason that the two should not be wed. This was a legal requirement and offered people a chance to out a liar, cheater, or imposter. Today it's just a holdover formality, but back in the day, it was serious business. You can see the remnants of the real fear people had about this in some of the older English novels, where the women find out that the man has a wife in another city, and therefore her marriage is nullified and she is ashamed for sleeping with a married man in an illegitimate marriage. Shady stuff back in the day. Anyway, I'm sure someone will come along and correct me, but as far as I remember, that's what it's for. Interestingly, bands still feature here. UK. My wife and I had our bands read in church for 3 consecutive Sundays before we could get married. At risk of being a hypocrite, it made the whole thing seem quite special. Even though I'm an atheist, my wife isn't. My older cousin had been married and divorced, then dated a new guy, and they were going to get married. At the wedding she got cold feet and didn't come out when the music started to play. Everyone was waiting there for like an hour until she finally came out. I was like 5 and only remember thinking, why isn't she coming out? Doesn't she hear the music? That's cute, but the pianist was P. I was at a wedding one time where just as the bride and groom were about to kiss, some crazy guy starts banging on the window on the balcony of the church. He was yelling out Cassandra, which was weird because that wasn't the name of the bride. He must have realized this when everyone turned to look. He looked embarrassed, apologized and ran. To this day no one has any idea of who that guy was. Mrs. Balvier. One of my good friends was marrying my cousin and I was the best man in the wedding. He had never really got along with my cousin's dad, uncle, so things were always weird with them. So as my uncle walked her down the aisle to give her away, the pastor asked, "Who gives this woman to be wed?" He responds, "Her mother does, but I do not." Then he looked at my buddy and went on a 3-minute rant about how he better treat her good or there will be repercussions. The whole wedding party was like WTF and the pastor thought it was some sort of joke. So then after all that happened, in front of 350 plus people I might add, we go through the rest of the ceremony in a bit of shock. Then as everyone has about left for the reception, they, uncle and groom, Happen to pass each other in the church's main lobby. He puts a shoulder into my uncle and says something to the lines of "you're a freaking butthole," and that's when they started swinging. Me and one of the other groomsmen break it up, as they are both freaking the frick out, in the middle of the Baptist church. My cousin and her mom are crying profusely and the limo ride afterwards was awful. The reception was the most awkward, weird, and ignorant thing I have ever been to. It was back and forth between them and then both dads got into a shouting match. Literally a train wreck. Needless to say, they got divorced about 2 years ago. We still talk about it to this day though. One of the craziest things I have experienced. I know I'm late, but I usually share this story. This year my pastor's son got married after delaying the wedding by almost a year. The reason was because his GF's family objected to him. He's an incredibly sweet guy, but her family didn't want her marrying him. They tried for months and months to try and smooth things out, but eventually the wedding happened. His entire family came. Her parents, sisters, etc. were no-shows. Only an aunt and some of her cousins came. She walked down the aisle by herself. Her dad didn't even come to give her away. They're doing great, but the family still seems to be cold to the marriage. I can't imagine why she still speaks to her family. Nothing happened during the ceremony, but when my dad got remarried, my grandmother had a few champagnes and started to wonder if my dad actually really knew his new wife. They got married really quick, and if this was a mistake. It turns out she was talking to my new stepmom's mom. Stepmom's mom tells stepmom. Stepmom confronts grandmother. It gets a little heated until my grandfather tells a joke and defuses the situation just enough for everyone to back off. Also turns out my grandmother was right. It's probably because it's 1 in the morning, but you lost me somewhere there. I'll try again when I wake up. Went to the wedding of a friend. It was in Vegas at a wedding chapel. Another friend of mine stood up during the objection part, in a full Jedi garb, raised his purple lightsaber, yes, he's black, to the air and said "I do." The bride told him to sit down, and after a moment, he did. The pastor looked at everyone and said, "This'll be a fun one." Yes, actually, I was best man in my friend's wedding and the groom's mother, who has a bad case of paranoid schizo, stood up and said, "They're just going to get divorced." She gets up and walks out and down the aisle and out the church doors. The groom looks at everyone and says, "Don't mind her, that's just my mom," and everything went on like nothing happened. No, but I wish. Friend getting married young because of pregnancy to psycho boyfriend with a temper. Can't see it going well for anyone. My ex-wife and I had a significantly more funny and fun than solemn wedding. We specifically included a pause and instructed everyone in the party to look at my father at the speak now bit, which we only included for him. He was exactly the person who would have stood up at that point, looked around, stretched and sat back down. It was his cue. Sadly, he didn't. I never asked why. That sounds brilliant. My mother-in-law objected. She was worried I was leading her son down the path of darkness. She is Mormon and I am not. My husband basically told her to frick off. She and her family left in tears and we continued the wedding. 12 years later, we are pretty dang happy in love still. I went to one where the father objected beforehand and did not attend. The mother was her daughter's maid of honor and was just in tears the entire time. Real tears, like Native American tears. Side note, it was a rural garden wedding and there was a goat sounding off 20 feet away from the reception. Wasn't a big issue until the microphone stopped working. The goat was heard over the entire hours. I was a groomsman at a wedding recently, and when we got to that part the officiant said if anyone has any objections, you've had 6 months while the wedding was being planned to voice them and now it's too late. Pretty funny. It got a good laugh. It was a beautiful ceremony at a beach house looking out over the ocean. We're all out on the deck and the preacher is going through his spiel and gets to the objection part. The bride's brother jumps up to his feet and yells "I object," and her dad, sitting down at this point, also leaps to his feet, pulls out a flintlock pistol and shoots him. God dang. That pirate themed wedding was the best thing I've been to. I feel like I've seen this before very recently. Anyway, if this hasn't been said already, I understand in England in a church wedding saying "I object" is very dangerous. co-flaw still applies, which means the wedding cannot go ahead until there has been a formal investigation of the grounds of the objection. Furthermore, the bride is to be made a ward of the church until the investigation has been concluded. If the objection is upheld, the bride remains a ward of the church until encouraged to remarry or join a convent. If the objection is overruled, the person who objected is liable for all the costs of the delay. Source: I read this somewhere, can't remember where, probably the last time this was on Reddit. TLDR, do not object in an English wedding. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.